I want to ask you about a form of organizing that often um, is not visible to a lot of people. I mean, by the design of the structure of prisons, but that is prison organizing, which is, you know, organizing inside the prisons, which is something that you've done a lot of work and activism around. I'm wondering if you can talk about sort of the sort of recent work in prison organizing over the last 10, 15 years. What's been happening? What should people know about the work that people are actually doing to organize in the prisons, as people have been organizing in prisons going back, you know, all the way back?
Yeah, you know, and I think there are these different kind of eras or phases that we can talk about that that, you know, that I think attend to different dynamics. But I think really the period from 2010 to 2020, let's say, that decade, witnessed a profound series of labor and hunger strikes that began in 2010 in Georgia, that spread in California, with a series of hunger strikes between 2011 and 2013. At their height, had 30,000 people participating. And now in California, that began specifically out of men who were incarcerated in solitary confinement, right? So I just pause and think about that for a second. Right? Here, initiated by 4 men held in solitary confinement and able to organize something that involved ultimately 30,000 people across the state is profound, right? And I think these sorts of coordinated actions spread, ultimately giving us the 2 nationwide prison strikes in 2016, 2018. And in the background of all of this is ongoing hunger strikes and lawsuits at the US prison at Guantanamo in Cuba, which a vestige of the war on terror that still exists. And so I think you have, right, within the international context of US incarceration, you have a decade of very sustained labor and hunger strikes alongside other forms of organizing, of lawsuits, of study groups, of what limited access to kind of petitioning the authorities exist in prison. And I think there are several things accompanying that I think are really profound. This is obviously, that decade is the decade of Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter and Idle No More, right? And I think, and a series of other kinds of protest movements in the streets. And I think it's important to recognize them together, right? That protests in one domain are often inspirations to and influences and protests in another. And that includes going from the streets to prison, but it also includes going from prisons to the streets. And I think that was absolutely the case in the 1960s. It was the case in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, it's really the case of incarceration, right? That is never as far as removed from society as many people would like to think that it is or should be. And I think the reasons for the strikes, I mean, they're shared in the sense of prison conditions being abysmal and violent, but there's a lot of variation there. So like the national prison strike, the people who called for the national prison strike in 2018 were talking a lot about labor rights. And that came from people incarcerated in Alabama, where people have to do agricultural labor. Right? Incarcerated people do work in the fields, right? So their statement was, let the crops rot in the fields. And that's a vestige of the kind of convict leasing era of prison that we were talking about before. But the reality is that most prisoners don't work, right? Certainly don't do the kind of productive work of working in the fields, right? Most prisoners, if they work, they do institution jobs. They work in the kitchen. They sweep the tier. They work in the laundry room, right? They do the work that kind of reproduces the prison itself, but they're not doing kind of productive labor that is generating a profit for anyone. And so what I think you saw in these strikes is people fighting about solitary confinement, people fighting about general abuse, people fighting about censorship in prison, right? But the recognition that prison conditions were vile and repugnant sparked a series of protests. COVID has, in some ways, changed everything and nothing at the same time.
Mhm.
So as the pandemic shut things down in the spring of 2020, people, prisons shut down people coming in from outside. So that meant an end to education programs where they existed. That meant an end to volunteer programs, an end to visits, and this kind of permanent rolling lockdown for people who are incarcerated. And that largely remains, right? So some visits have come back in some places, but a lot of the education programming hasn't. A lot of the other kinds of programming hasn't. And then you have prison systems, for various reasons, trying to eliminate paper mail. So people can't receive physical mail, they can receive things on a tablet. Prisons trying to eliminate books coming in. So again, prisoners can buy things on a tablet but not be sent a free book. And that's both a proprietary issue, but it's also a sort of free speech issue, because the tablets are private property that have a kind of precented list of what publications are acceptable. So far fewer things are allowed. So you have this, on the one hand, this dramatic deterioration of conditions that people can't visit each other, that they are they're more isolated internally, but at the same time they can't access the things that they might have been able to access that might increase their mind, that might feed their soul, that might otherwise be educational or informative. And so at the start of COVID, you had dozens of uprisings in jails, prisons, and detention centers, basically saying, we deserve public health too, right? And there's a lot of writings, I wrote a couple pieces, but as did many, many others, about how antithetical prisons are, jails, prisons, and detention centers are to the idea of public health, that people are too crowded together to be able to socially distance, that there's not the kind of ventilation and airflow that you need for safety, and that people need to be released, right? That public health required and still requires people to be released. That mass incarceration is a component, is a vector of disease. And even if you don't care about people who are in prison, those are not the only people getting sick, right? So guards come and go, and they bring the disease in and then pass it to a prisoner who might pass it to another guard who brings that to a totally separate community, right? So they become these sort of vectors of disease. And the conditions have just deteriorated to abject levels that, there is just a mounting catastrophe throughout our jails, prisons, and detention centers that is familiar from the AIDS crisis. It's familiar from outbreaks of tuberculosis, but is far more expansive than anything I think we've seen before.
One of the real ideological props of mass incarceration, it seems to me, is these types of processes of dehumanization that go from turning people into criminals, right? With all of those associations, and obviously the notion of the criminal is racialized, but that dehumanization then sanctions, truly inhumane conditions that we are sort of socialized to accept as being, well, that's prison, that's okay,
right.
And that is a process of learning to think of people as not being part of the community, or not being people that we need to really think about or care about, or treat the way that we would treat human beings. Do you have a sense that is shifting, that people's perception of prison conditions, people that are incarcerated, that has shifted?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more opportunity. I think a lot more formerly incarcerated people are speaking out about their experience of having been incarcerated. I think there are more venues for currently incarcerated people to write and publish. I think a lot more people are sharing their family experience of incarceration. So, which is to say, even if they weren't incarcerated, that their loved one or sibling, or not to juxtapose loved ones and siblings, and that their parent or sibling or other loved one was incarcerated, and the toll that it takes, right? You know, the emotional toll, but also the financial toll of spending that money to restock someone's phone card so that they can call you, right? Of sending money so that they can buy some halfway healthy food as opposed to what they get in the child line, et cetera. So I think there's a lot more space, and people are sharing a lot more. And I think we have a lot more information. There are even things like, you know, podcasts of currently incarcerated people describing their conditions. You know, there have been several issues of or instances of incarcerated people getting cell phones that allow them to take pictures of what's happening inside. So I think all that promising. I think no amount of visibility on its own is going to create a change, right? So you know, I think we should think about this of visibility being a necessary but insufficient component of change. But I'm very heartened by the number of both currently and formerly incarcerated people speaking out about it, and kind of providing us this, you know, thick description of what it all means, right? For people who are incarcerated, but also what it all means to be coming out, right? And navigating this complex web of bureaucratic restrictions. And so I think there's been a profound shift in people's consciousness, and a profound shift in the ability to have those kinds of conversations. And I think, as with so many other issues in the United States, there's a big chasm between popular opinion and political change.
Right.